Hello there. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Victor, and today's date is October 22nd, 2025. And this is my fourth official podcast, but first since 2012. In 2012, I did three podcasts and posted them on YouTube. It was Victor's History of Progressive Rock, Part 1 and Part 2, and also a quick history of my personal favorite band, Von der Graaf Generator, which I posted in 2012 as a kind of a goof. And I'm going to start doing podcasts. I know everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, but I'm going to continue. I'm going to start or continue doing podcasts for myself, right? Really for my pleasure. And be touching on a variety of subjects: music, history, art history, sports history, cultural history, my own personal history. Everyone tells me I should write a book, but we'll get to that later. So, being that this is my first podcast or attempt at a podcast in how many years? 12 years, 13 years. Let's do Victor's History of Progressive Rock, Part 3. Okay, so even though it's Part 3, I'm going to attempt to restart the history of progressive rock as I did in 2012, but obviously not exactly the way I did it back then. Okay, let's begin. So, if you're going to start with rock music, you're going to start with obviously Elvis, mid 50s, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, all that, Roy Orbison. That's before my time. I pretty much came of age with the Beatles. And the Beatles were special because the Beatles pretty much broke down all doors, broke down all, actually didn't break anything, broke down or created all avenues for everyone else to do what they wanted to do, artistically speaking. So the first few Beatle albums were pretty basic from today's point of view, but at the time were revolutionary. George Martin had a lot to do with that because George was the fifth Beatle and did help them with sound effects and everything but the writing. One of them would ask, hey, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we phase? Can we do back loops? Can we do things backwards? Can we have guitar feedback? All of which was very new at the time. So after the Beatles, that pretty much broke down the door for everything else. American bands like the Beach Boys and Frank Zappa and a lot of other bands were doing things close to what the Beatles were attempting. As a matter of fact, the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, heard Rubber Soul, was blown away and did Pet Sounds. And then Paul heard Pet Sounds, was blown away and did Sgt. Pepper, and went on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And then in the early 1970s, Flower Power, Psychedelia had gone the way of the dodo bird, and we had a different type of rock music that was also progressive. But no more Flower Power, no more hippy dippy. But it was more still serious. Bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, my personal favorite, Uriah Heep. A more heavier, more rockier sound, but still complicated music and still very, very, very progressive. Although it wouldn't fall in the genre of progressive, in my opinion, that's still progressive. And at the time, I was only exposed to AM radio that was still playing. At that time, all music was progressive, actually. Everything on AM radio, at the time I would dismiss. But now I look back and I hear it and I'm like, wow, that's really amazing. I'll give you a quick example. Puff the Magic Dragon, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel. The list is on and on and on and on and on. So by the mid-70s, that started to fade out. Oh, I'm sorry. At the same time, in Germany, electronic music, a lot of bands like Kahn, Faust, Kraftwerk, New, Harmonia, a lot of these type of bands had been experimenting with electronic music. There's a great video on the birth of electronic music called Krautrock, and that's on YouTube, so that explains that in much more detail. And that spawned electronic music in a sense that Yes, or even the Beatles having used their first synthesizer. I forgot the track. I think it's on Abbey Road. It might be Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Even though, in my opinion, the Beatles' psychedelic attempts were Strawberry Fields and Sgt. Pepper, even She Said, She Said, and, Paperback Writer, that all had elements of what was happening at the time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves or far away from ourselves. So now we're into the mid-'70s. So we have in Germany electronic music. We have in America disco. And that kind of meshed into one because Trans-Europe Express actually was played in discotheques like Studio 54. And then everything, of course, meshed into one at the same time. Punk was happening, which was like anti-hippie. Hippie had to be destroyed, so punk came out, and everybody hated punk. But punk developed into post-punk, which was also very progressive. And I could name a million bands from the late 70s. Teardrop Explodes, Psychedelic Furs, Modern Neon. Great bands that were under the punk label, but weren't really punk. They were progressive punk or post-punk. And then we go to the 1980s, and we have now full electronic blown, music, Soft Cell, Human League, Ultravox, Kraftwerk, so many bands. And then a million bands would put out separate 12 inches. I'm going to give you one example. One of my favorites was Section 25, Looking from a Hilltop. So many bands, millions and millions of bands, which led us to the late 80s and the birth of New Beat, which morphed into Acid House, which morphed into House. New Beat coming from Belgium, House and Techno. House came from Chicago, Techno came from Detroit. And then we had the early 90s where house music formed into trance, formed into harder techno, more progressive house, drum and bass, and so on and so forth. Okay, so since this is an experimental podcast, and since this is something that I still need to review, I'm going to end here. And thank you very much for listening. And hopefully all of you will look forward to my upcoming podcast in the future. You all have a lovely day, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.